Good afternoon and welcome to DBS Solutions Zoom session Truss Part 2. Once again, thank you very much for turning up. There's kind of not a lot of point in doing these things if nobody's interested, so that's really good. Don't worry if you missed Part 1. This kind of stands alone, so it won't be a problem. Thank you very much to our sponsors, ProLight Concepts and Global Truss, for basically making this happen. Thanks to DBS there's a whole world of technology over there and people and beautiful assistants pressing buttons, and we've still not got him in a sparkly dress, but never mind. So thank you to them for setting all this up. Zoom session or a YouTube video, they're never going to be a replacement for real world proper face-to-face training, but hopefully you'll find it useful and maybe it might point out some of the bits where you do need some full-on training. On the Zoom side of things, a bit of kind of practicalities really. If you can keep yourself muted, that would be good. I'm kind of used to delivering this in a classroom environment, and I try and make it interactive, and I ask you lots of questions to try and get you thinking. Maybe don't answer. I'll ask the question, pause for a bit to let you have a think about it, and then tell you what I think. We'll do some question and answer sessions. I'm going to break this one up a little bit because it does kind of come in chunks. So you will get a chance to ask your questions. We'll do those via the texty typey chat thing. And then Chris will sort of pass the questions back to me and I shall do my best to answer. I get 2 flags. First flag is later. Sometimes, you know, you're thinking about what I'm talking about and it leads to a question. And I'm going to talk about it in the next bit. So I'm allowed a later flag. I've also got a I don't know flag. I don't know everything. If you've got a question and I don't know the answer, I'll see what I can do to find out and get you an answer by email or something. But I do have an I don't know flag. Okay. Hello. I'm Alan McGregor. Been in the live events industry now. I used to say how long, but that got quite embarrassing. All my working life. I was originally on the lighting side of things, but I've been a freelance rigger for over 10 years now. Obviously, I do training. I deliver total trainings courses for UK Rigging in Bolton. We also do custom and bespoke stuff and on-site training and that kind of thing. I've been involved a bit in the development of the National Event Lifting Training, the NELT, and I'm one of the trainers that delivers that. You'll find me in front of a computer, do a lot of CAD and drawings and that kind of stuff, part of the team that does the roof analysis for Manchester Arena every time they have an event. Freelance side of things, I'm a production rigger for conference and corporate stuff, project management, consultant, projects, installations, all that kind of stuff. And you will still find me pulling points. Still a rigger if you like. If we ever get up and running again, I'll be back in Liverpool. It's probably the place I've worked the most. I must admit, these days I try to be the person on the ground doing the pointing and the shouting, but sometimes I don't get away with that, and it is actually me up there pulling chain and steel. Okay, so that's a bit about me. If we could just go to PowerPoint, please. Thank you. So in part 1, we had a bit of a look at how truss works. That was all that we like triangles because they're strong. We like the nodes or the corners because they're the strong points. We had a look at the planes of strength, in which directions the truss is strong. And we discovered we liked compression and expansion, but we weren't so keen on bending things side to side. We then had a bit of a look at how you might sling your truss, i.e. pick it up, connect it to your chain hoist. We had a look at some of the kit, things like shackles and round slings and soft steels and that kind of stuff. And then we actually looked at how you might use them on the truss and what happens to the forces when you wrap them around in different kinds of ways. And we looked at some real world examples of pickups people use and what that might do to the truss. Okay, so in part 2, we're going to have a bit of a look at how much can you hang off your truss and the different things that happen when you hang them off in different ways. And then kind of in part 2 of part 2, we'll have a look at how the load moves through the truss to the hoists. So what happens when I put a weight on? Where does the weight go? So that will be kind of the second bit. All right, so coming to our first bit, how much can you hang off your truss? If you did do part one, you might remember there's a certain answer that kind of crops up rather a lot in my little talks. And yet again, the answer is refer to manufacturer's instructions. If you do so, somewhere in there will be something that looks a little bit like this. There'll be a lot of other stuff as well, hopefully, but there will be what's known as a load table. This is the load table for Global Truss's F34. Nice shiny, you've even cleaned it, I'm quite impressed. Nice shiny truss. If you look at that big load table there, down the left-hand side, it says span. If I could come to the iPad, please. We're not talking about the overall length of the truss. I need to pick that. So here's our little scenario, if you like. I've got a bit of truss on 3 hoists. And you need to break it up into the lengths between supports is probably the best way of describing it. So at the end here, we've got a sticky out bit. We'll come back to that in a minute. But we're going to need to look at each span individually. So here's a span. We would look at that one for how much we could hang on that. Then we would look at this span. And then finally, there's another strange sticky out bit off the end. So when it's talking about spans, it's talking about the bit of truss between the supports, if you like. Okay. If we come back to the PowerPoint, please. Thank you. If we look at our load table, have I got focus? There we go. Excuse me. The first thing you'll see is some numbers for a uniformly distributed load, UDL. All the way across the span. Good example of that would be a drape. A lot of your LED walls would count as a uniformly distributed load. To be honest, an awful lot of lighting trusses do. You know, it's 20 mover, kilo mover, 20 kilo mover. It's effectively a uniformly distributed load. A UDL is what the truss likes the best. That's the, as far as it's concerned, that's the nicest way for it to be loaded. So if we look at an A span, it says we can hang 135 kilograms. So yeah, think about kilos. You can have a uniformly distributed load. If you do that, it tells you the truss will bend or deflect quite a useful little. If you know roughly how much it should bend and it bends something different, you probably want to find out why. You know, if it's bent more than it's supposed to, somebody's added some load that you don't know about. The lampies have come along and stuck 6 more moving lights on it. You're potentially overloading it. If it's less than it's supposed to be, you probably ought to check as well. The lampies might have taken 6 moving lights off. Where have they put them? They've probably gone on something else. You've also got an issue if things aren't what you expect them to be, is you need to tell people. Because if the load on your truss isn't what you said it was going to be, the load on your hoist has changed. And then the loads you're applying to the roof have changed. People need to know about that. So there we go. That's a uniformly distributed load and a little bit about deflection. If you come across the table, I've lost me again. The next one it gives you is a center point load. And this is really it going from one extreme to the other. This is you taking all the load and are putting it in the worst possible place right in the middle of the span. And if we look at the numbers on this one, if we pick 8 meters again, it says you can hang 494 kilos slap bang in the middle of that 8-meter span. And if you do, it'll bend around about 4.5 centimeters. Center point load numbers can be a useful little quick check because it is the worst possible case. There's no way to apply the load to the truss that is worse than this. So if you want to do kind of a bit of a quick check or whatever when you're out on site, you can just ballpark it. Get your calculator out on your phone of 8 movers at this, 8 movers at that, bung in a bit for the cable, add it all up. And if that number is less than the maximum center point load, in terms of the truss strength, you can stop worrying about it because there's no way they can put it on the truss, you know, in a worse configuration, if you like. So it can be quite a good little ready check on site. If we come across the table to the next bit, it's a third point load. This is 2 things on the truss. Engineers kind of think about it a bit differently. They don't think about how many loads you apply. They think about how many effectively little subspans you break it down into. So a third point load is 2 things evenly spaced on the span. And same deal. We can look at an 8-meter span. It says you can hang 2 things of 353 kilos. So that's a total load of 700 roughly. And it'll bend just over 5 centimeters. You could still use that quick check thing in terms of adding it all up and is it okay? But now you've got a judgment call to make because now they could, in theory, hang it in a worse way than this. So you have to be happy that how the load is being applied to the truss is better or more distributed, if you like, than the 2 things third point load scenario. If you continue across, it's just more of the same. The next column is a quarter, which is 3 things. And the last kind of chunk is a fifth, which is 4 loads. So the time you get much beyond that, you're getting pretty close to a uniformly distributed load, really. So for each of our spans, you can have a look at the numbers and check what you're doing is all right, basically. However, if you remember at the start, there was the funny sticky out bits at the end. So they're what's known as a cantilever. So a cantilever is where it's only supported at one end. And there should be some separate data for that. So here we go, same product, cantilever loads. It's saying for sticking out 3 meters, 10 feet beyond the last hoist, as a uniformly distributed load, you can hang 179 kilos per meter. Perhaps more relevant, you can hang 317 kilograms at the end of it. I mean, that's pretty scary, but the manufacturer says you can. And if you do, it'll bend 2.3, whatever it is, centimeters. The manufacturer is saying you can. They're not saying it's necessarily a good idea. If we just come to camera for a minute. I mean, it's upside down, but it's the same thing, if you see what I mean. Here's my 2 points. Here's my bit of truss. Manufacturer says 1 meter, whatever it is, how much you can hang off this end. But if you don't put anything on the other end, the whole thing's going to tip over and probably fall out the sky. So yes, the truss is strong enough, but you have to do a bit of an assessment of the stability of all of it as to whether it's actually a good idea or not. Okay. Give myself a little bit of space. Got ahead of myself. So that's given you, from the manufacturer's data, the information you need as to how much you can hang on each span and the cantilevers at the end. Let's just do a quick questions on that. If there are any, type them in on the chat, or if we're happy, we can move on. All looking okay? There will be more questiony bits, and I don't mind going back. So if you think of any, don't worry about it. Okay, let's come back to PowerPoint again, please. Let's talk a little bit more. I haven't got focus. Too much technology. No, we've done that. Let's talk a little bit more about truss cantilevers, because there's some kind of issues with these, really. This is Liverpool Philharmonic, probably my favorite gig. It's a great one to work, because that roof you can see is a false ceiling, and the actual beams that you rig off are above it. That false ceiling is a foot thick concrete. You're not going to be making any new holes in it. The points are where the points are. And the vast majority of those points have a hoist up on the roof above them. So most of the time, all I have to do is press buttons, which is fabulous. We like that a lot. However, the points being where the points are can cause you some problems. Could I come to the iPad, please? So, how do I? Like that. Okay. I'm not very good at drawing this, but we'll have a go. Here is Liverpool Philharmonic. The points are where the points are. End of story. Now, it's a fantastic white, amazing grade something listed building. But usually every November, they want to do a panto. Obviously not last November, but prior to that, they used to do a panto. And they want it to look like a theatre. What they call that cross arch black box. So they want to put a truss in here. They're going to put some legs on it, like that. And there'll be a border across the top. So they're trying to make that black box so it looks like a theatre. Points are where, that one's kind of in the wrong place, but the points are where the points are. There's nothing I can do about that. So the only place we could pick this very wide truss up would be there. If you look at this bit, that's a huge cantilever. You might have the information for the truss and you might look at it and you might decide it's all right. To be honest, if it was just like drape, black wool serge, the house truss is incredibly strong, you probably would be okay. But if they wanted to hang flats or something heavier off it, you've got a bit of an issue here, because that's about 5 meters, which is a very big cantilever. There are some options. So what we could do, is that going to go away? Yeah, perfect. On this end point, instead of going straight to the truss, I could do what's known as a truss bridle. So I could pick the truss up like that. There's a couple of issues if you do. First of all, you need to look at your particular scenario, but you're potentially losing a lot of trim height. In Liverpool Philharmonic, it doesn't make any difference because I've hit the roof. But if it was a flat roof where it could go higher, I can't, because that my truss bridle will stop me going as high. You're also into all those angular forces we talked about when we had a look at truss pickups. And if we did a weights demonstration thing with some scales, where we saw the forces in an angular pickup like that can get really, really big. So you're going to need to be careful there. Actually, let's come back to camera, please. There's a couple of other things you're going to need to be careful about. If you remember from part 1, when we were looking at truss, and we looked at structural trusses, this is 4 structural trusses, so it's strong in those directions. It's strong, designed to be picked up vertically and loaded vertically. If you look at that what the pickup's going to be like and the two ends of that truss bridle, instead of loading it vertically how it's designed to be loaded, I'm now pulling that way. I'm not loading it in the same direction. You're also starting to do really nasty things in terms of bending the truss. You're loading it how it's not designed to be loaded. You've got another issue as well, and it's particularly with this sort of truss. If that's going that way, I'm pulling on the cross braces. So you're potentially bending things. It's even harder with this sort of truss, because this sort of truss is not symmetrical. If I pick a node on my side, so it holds the round sling, even though that's not good because it's bending the cross brace, on the other side, it's even worse because there isn't one to hold it. And it's going to do all sorts of weird, strange things. It would actually be very difficult to pick this up at an angle because of that. Don't be tempted to use a hard fixing. You remember the bit of metal with the two clamps? If you were to do that and load it sideways, instead of the force being through the whole width of the clamp, 2 inches or whatever, it's going to all be on that sharp edge. So that's not going to work. You could potentially, I suppose, look at getting a hard fixing and putting it on an angle so it's at the nodes, but you're still twisting it over onto that sharp edge. So it's still not a good idea. This is one of those ones where I don't really have an answer for you, to be honest. With this sort of truss, you almost can't. If it was a truss that is symmetrical, so that the nodes are in the same place, personally, I would try and not do it. But if I had no other solution to my problem in the bigger picture, and I absolutely have to do that truss bridle, what I would do is I would wrap it as many times as I can, going away from where the pickup is. So I want to get it around 3 or 4 times if I can, and obviously it'll be the same on the other side. I don't know whether it's going to help or not, but you've a lot of grip here and a lot of friction. So I'm hoping that when this is loaded, there's a reasonable amount of grip and friction, so I'm not sideways loading onto the cross braces as much. Pardon my French, you can't polish a turd, but you can put sprinkles on it. That's kind of what you're doing with this. So do be careful if you're going to go that truss bridle route. Okay, this leads us to a few other things. Keep that there because I'm going to need it in a second. So we were looking at cantilevers. We've had a little bit of a look at truss bridles. How about everything we've looked at so far, our truss has been level. What happens if you want to hang it at a jaunty angle? We see an awful lot of that on shows these days. You know, lots of angled trusses, the 5 fingers of death standard lighting rig that we've seen for 30 years. People want to hang these at an angle. You've 2 issues really here. First of all your manufacturer's data on what you can hang off this truss is based on it being horizontal. As soon as you start doing this, all you're trying effectively different. You've no manufacturer's data to back up what you're doing. In some ways, it's similar to the truss bridle we were just looking at, because when I hang this, and that's vertical, when you put the truss at an angle, this is going to stay vertical. But now I've effectively got that angled pickup again. So I'm pulling the truss in a direction it's not designed to be pulled. You've also got an issue with your loads hanging off it. If I hang my moving light off here, gravity's downwards, This is a very nice global truss clamp. It's 1 inch wide roughly, so the load's being spread over an inch. Once I angle this, trying not to destroy everything in the process, it's the same as what we were talking about with the hard fixing. Gravity is still straight down. So you're going to be putting all the load on one edge of the clamp rather than spreading it over the width like it's supposed to. I'd love to be able to give you answers. There sort of aren't any. Manufacturers don't say what you can and can't do. I seem to remember seeing somewhere that ProLite with some of their truss said you couldn't go over 10 degrees, but most of the time there's no information at all. The only other thing I can kind of chuck into the mix, if you like, there's an American act, Trans-Siberian Orchestra, TSO. I don't think they're particularly big over here, but they're huge in the States, have an enormous light show. And years ago, they wanted to have an awful lot of trusses, all at jaunty angles. And they went back to their truss manufacturer and went, this is what we want to do. And the truss manufacturer made them some truss specifically designed to be hung at quite steep angles. It looked very different. So sorry, I don't have an answer for you, but you're on your own once you start hanging trusses at an angle. There's nothing in the manufacturer's data that says you can do that, and your load table goes out the window, because the load table is assuming it's horizontal and the load's evenly distributed between the two cords. Let's quickly, again, just because we're going to go on to something else. Are there any questions on that? Sorry, that was a lot of issues and not a lot of answers, but that's the real world. Yeah.
We've got one question from Matthew on Facebook, Alan, and that is, when rigging a cantilever, how do you ensure that you are not unbalancing whilst you apply the load? Is it just a case of applying the load at the same time on both ends, or is there another method that you can do so you're not overloading that cantilever?
I would have said you pretty much got it. You want to apply the loads that aren't on the cantilevers at the end first, and then put the ones on the cantilever. You can also apply a little bit of real world to this. You know, my example was a bit extreme. Normally, you, for the sake of argument, let's say 15 meters of truss with a 2 meter cantilever. There's a lot of truss weight there, but I would still, you know, play safe, put all the loads on the spans first, and then put the things on the cantilevers. I mean, the real world is most of the time, we're not hanging anything like those kind of loads. About the heaviest thing you tend to get on a cantilever actually is the cable drop off the end. People massively underestimate the weight of cable, but even so, and quite often you'll have put in a cable pick or whatever. So, I mean, it's good to be aware of, but hanging 350 kilos off a 10-foot cantilever of this stuff, because historically we don't have the information, or didn't have the information, we've always been really scared of them. And I would be, even though the manufacturer says I can, I'd be really uncomfortable kind of doing that. I kind of drifted off the topic there, but does that kind of answer that one, you think?
Yeah, I think so. There's just one more that goes back to the balance load across a truss, and it's Craig on Facebook asking, what if you are not flying your truss, but you're using uprights to support the horizontal, so sort of making a truss arch? How does that impact the UDL? I guess he's asking if the loading is still the same for the load tables as if you're flying it.
In terms of the load tables, it's the same. So yeah, there are a whole load of other issues once you start building goalposts. Possibly beyond this, but just quickly, so you've got some sort of idea. Is your truss rated to be used vertically? Remember, in our discussion in part 1, it was all about loading it that way, not necessarily loading it that way. Some are, you know, there's a lot of truss that, as well as doing what we've been talking about, is also designed to be used for ground support. So it is rated for doing it. You also need to have a little bit of a look at what happens with your legs, because if you think of that span at the top, and we apply a load to it, you check your load table and it's absolutely fine. But what does that bit of truss do when you apply a load to it? it bends, doesn't it? If you think of, actually, I don't have one, but if you think of the corner block on the end, am I still in? If that truss bends, I'm effectively rotating the corner block, which means the legs are going to want to splay outwards. If they do so, I'm no longer loading this vertically under compression. I'm doing something quite horrible to it. So you want to look at, it depends on the size of your structure, and it's beyond the remit of this really, but you want to look at trying to anchor your floor plates to the floor, or what you see with a lot of the big outdoor roofs is there's actually a steel running between the legs, or even solid steel holding them together so it can't do that splay thing. I've gone massively off topic and drifted off, but in answer to your initial question, in terms of the span across the top, it's the same. Any more? Okay. How are we doing? We're doing pretty good, actually. Fantastic. If we come back to PowerPoint. I wasn't too sure how long this was going to take, so there was an emergency tea break, but as we've only been going 35 minutes, I think we can just press on, can't we? So if you like, I'm not going. We'll do truss part 2, when we fix the technology. Red button on the top. That's a laser pointer. Do you want to just advance the slide for me? Okay. So we've had a bit of a look at whether our truss is strong enough to do what we want to do. But we have a bit more kind of analysis to do as well. We need to work out what the loads are going to be on our chain hoist once we hang all this stuff on the truss. So we pick an appropriate hoist or stand or whatever it is of appropriate capacity. B, because you're going to have to tell somebody what loads you're applying to the roof so that they can go yes or no, or you might be making that decision, but you need to know what loads you're applying to the roof. Okay, let's briefly come to camera if we could, please. What we're talking about here is, again, it's upside down, but it's the same thing. If I put a load somewhere on the truss, how much of it goes to this one and how much of it goes to that one? So we need to have a bit of an investigation. Don't worry about the numbers, we'll come back. If I could go back to PowerPoint, please. See if it, yay. Actually, I've got ahead of myself. I'm not supposed to be on PowerPoint. We'll leave it. I'm a guide parent to an 8-year-old Aria, and one of her favorite things to do is to go to the park, the playground in the park, and she loves the seesaw, you know, the plank that you sit on each end and you bounce up and down. However, so here's our seesaw in the playground, here's Aria, and here's me. However, I'm a little bit bigger than Aria, and it doesn't work very well, really, because I go down and she disappears off into space. If you're into engineering, if you've not been to a kid's playground recently, I would recommend it. They've got some really neat, clever stuff. And what they've done to the seesaw so that you don't have this problem is at the pivoty bit, there's a wheel. And when you turn the wheel, it moves the plank to one side or the other. So you can adjust the plank so that it works for two people of different weights. So we're balanced effectively. And it solves the problem. Me and Aria can bounce up and down and we have a great time. Well, we did till Aria discovered that when her end was right down at the ground, she could dive off sideways. And then I would come down like a rocket, hit the ground with quite a bang, which she thought was really funny. And I thought I'd nearly broken my coccyx. But that's kind of, we're drifting off on a tangent again. Okay, so here we've now got this situation on the seesaw with me and Aria on it, and we are balanced. If you think about it, there's the weight of the plank, Aria, and me. All that load is being applied to that pivot point. All that weight is on the pivot point. We know a little bit about that. It's not complicated. If we ignore the weight of the plank for a minute, basically the load on that pivot point is my weight and Aria's weight. I'm a professional rigger, and I used to be in the Boy Scouts briefly. So I never leave home without a packet of cigarettes, a bottle of red wine, a bit of chalk, a laser, and finally getting to the relevant one, a tape measure. So we can actually measure some distances on this. So I know how far I am from the pivot point, distance Alan, and I know how far Aria is, distance Aria, and you can either measure it or just add the two together. I know how long my plank is. We actually know even more than that about this situation. We've got this perfectly balanced. It's not moving. So we know that the leverage on my side must be the same as the leverage on Aria's side. If one was bigger than the other, it would go up or down. They've got to be the same. And that's not complicated either. My weight times my distance from the pivot must be the same as Aria's weight times her distance from the pivot. At this point, you might be thinking, he's been smoking wacky backy in that tea break we didn't even get. There is a relevance to this. How the load moves through the truss from where the load is to the chain hoists is the same. And if I magically change that plank into a bit of truss, and I can then magically change me into a chain hoist. Nothing's changed with the equations. I've just changed the words. Instead of it being the weight of Alan, it's how much of the load moves to point one. And instead of it being how far's the load from Alan or how far is Alan from the pivot, it's now the distance from the point to the load. So nothing's actually changed. We can do the same thing with Aria, magically turn her into a chain hoist as well. Swap the things around in the equations, and it's the same. So we've got our two equations here. You can go off and do a bit of algebra with them and play around with them. I'm not going to. You'd be even more asleep than you already are, but it's not actually that difficult. You take the two equations, you jiggle them around a bit, and what you end up with is this. So what it's saying is the amount of the load that is applied to point one is the length of the span minus the distance of the load from the point, all divided by the length of the span times the load. So it's a fraction or a ratio, if you like, of the load. And the other one's the same. The amount of the load that goes to point two is the span minus the distance to point two, all divided by the span and times the load. Now that's a bit mathsy, and some people think mathsy, some people don't. So let's just put some numbers in it, and maybe that'll make it a little bit clearer. So let's say that my load's 100 kilos. It's the load's 2 meters from one point, 4 meters from the other point. So hence my span must be 6 meters. If you plumb the numbers into the equations, if we look at how much of that load goes to point one, it's the span 6 minus the distance 2, which is 4, all divided by the distance 6, 4/6, which is 2/3. 2/3 of 100 is round about 67 kilos. If you go and do it at the other end, same deal. Span of 6 minus a distance of 4 is 2, all divided by the span again, 6, 2/6, so a third of 100 is about 33 kilos. I like it when you go through this process and the answers that come out are kind of intuitively correct. It kind of makes me a bit more comfortable. the load is closer to 0.1 than 0.2. You would expect more of it intuitively to go to 0.1 than went to 0.2. And that's what's happening. There's 67 on one and 33 on the other. We're also not creating anything out of thin air. 67 plus 33 is 100. So they're kind of intuitively correct, really, which is good. Okay, let's come back to camera briefly, please. So what we're saying is, if I apply all of the load at the point, as you would kind of expect, all 4 kilograms is on this one. If I then move my load a quarter of the way along the truss, these scales aren't that accurate, so don't expect it to be like totally precise. I've gone a quarter of a way along the truss. So a quarter of this load is now going to that one. And there's only 3/4 left on this one. So I've got round about 3 kilos and round about 1 kilo. As you would sort of expect, by the time I get to the middle, there's roughly 2 on each. By the time I get 3/4 of the way along the truss, 3/4 of it's going to that one and 1/4 of it's going to that one. Here's a quick check to make sure it's worked, and it has. So it's you're just proportionally splitting up the distance, really, but that's how it would change as it moves along the truss. Okay, if we come back to PowerPoint, please. So that's on a span, but we've got them jaunty cantilevers at the end to deal with as well. Have I got it? Or just advance me, one of the two? There we go. You can do the same thing again, all that leverage and area and the seesaw and all the rest of it. And you end up with 2 equations. The load that's applied to the nearest point, or the one at the end, if you like, it's the span minus the length of the cantilever divided by the span. And the amount that's on the other one is minus the distance, the length of the cantilever divided by the span. They are actually the same equations, but you just need to be careful with signs, and some of the numbers become negative. If you just put normal numbers into that, it kind of works. What's kind of interesting with that, if we come back to camera, I'm thinking about that negative one as well. I can't completely show this because it'll fall over, but if I do something a bit like that, I'm going to have to put my hand on this. See if it'll work. Oh, yeah. So if I've got a load on the end of a cantilever, it's effectively acting as a lever round the point. So this one actually wants to go up. It's getting very precarious. There you go. It's pushing up quite strongly on my hand. So the load on that one's negative. That stability thing we were talking about, unless you put some more loads on it, it's going to tip over. It's all got to balance out. So you've got a negative one here, and you've got this. The load on the point, the first one, this one, is more than the weight of that, because it's the weight of this and the load over here. You need to watch it because my scales don't actually go high enough. It's gone all the way around and it's starting again. So we're kind of at like 6 kilos or something because of that leverage effect. So you do need to be careful with cantilevers and the loads you're applying to the point nearest the cantilever, and also what you're doing in terms of negative loads on the other ones. Okay, can't done that. All my papers sticking together. We've done that, done that. Okay, let's come back to PowerPoint, please. So you're going to need to do that, the mass in your equations, for every load that is applied to the truss and to every span and every cantilever. The reality is you're probably going to put it into a spreadsheet. Otherwise, it's just going to take you forever. But you know, down the side of this, I've got all the things that are on the truss. I've got how much they weigh, where they are, either measured from the center of the truss or from the end of the truss. And then it works out for me how much of the load goes to point 1, point 2, point 3, point 4, and point 5. This is obviously a 5-point truss. And then it adds it all up down the bottom. I would add a bit of a kind of caveat or warning to this, really. You have a statutory obligation under LOLA for lifting operations to be planned by a competent person. You need to know what you're doing if you're starting to do that kind of stuff and plumbing it into spreadsheets and all the rest of it. But that is what you would do, and that would be the maths that you would use to do it. Okay, let's just come back to camera, please. I did say right at the start of all this that it's just an approximation. It's called a proportional distribution approximation, because we are assuming, like the plank on the seesaw, that our truss is completely rigid and doesn't bend. But we already know that's not the case. Our truss bends. So it's not 100% accurate, if you like. Where are my other bits? So how might we get the real answer? You know, we can approximate it, but it would really be quite nice to know what the real answer was, wouldn't it? You could just weigh it. You can get a thing called a load cell, which is basically a digital version of a scale. They're usually built into the body of a shackle. So you would put them in your pickup or even at the point in the roof. They've got a display on them, but they all talk back to a computer. You can get it to do fancy things like give you overload or underload warnings and all the rest of it. If you're super duper posh, you can actually get battery powered wireless ones, so you don't even have to run all the cables. So you could weigh it. They're a thing we ought to use a lot more than we do. Where we do see it is in Touring World. We'll get a drawing through with the estimated weights on it. Version 1, fantastic. They'll then go into production rehearsals for 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks to get the show all sorted out before they actually head out. And they will hire the load cells for the production rehearsals, and they'll actually weigh it. And we'll get a version 2 plot through a little bit later on going, we've weighed this now, here are the real weights. So the only thing you perhaps need to consider is you need to estimate it first, so you're actually sure everything's strong enough and you're not going to do something silly, but you can get the real weights later on with a set of load cells. There's something else you could do. The maths of how this truss bends under load is quite complicated. It's called finite element analysis. You can get very expensive computer programs that do it. There are people that are trained to do it. You need quite a lot of knowledge to even do it, because you need to understand what's going on in the different types of metal and the tubes and all the rest of it. There are other people who can do it, but being able to do it is part of a structural engineer's qualification. So you could go to a structural engineer and go, here's what I'm going to do. What's the load going to be on the hoists? The only kind of disadvantage with that is structural engineers are not cheap by any stretch of the imagination. So you might be better approaching one of the other solutions, if you like. Okay, let's do a real world one. Don't panic. We're going to deliberately, to make it easy on ourselves, pick a really, really simple one that we hardly need to use the formulas at all. If I could come back to the iPad, please. Get that one out the way. Okay, let's make it really easy for ourselves. Here is our scenario. We have a bit of truss with an LED video wall on it. The truss and the video wall weigh a ton. And we're going to pick it up. Oh, I've not left myself enough space. On 2 hoists. right at the end. So there's nothing complicated going on. What do you think the load's going to be to each hoist? It's not a trick question. It really is that simple. Oh, not even left myself enough room to write 500. Brilliant. However, let's say in our little scenario, our venue has plenty of points that we can attach to in the roof, but they're only rated to 0.5 ton, 500 kilos. And we probably go, ooh, that's just a bit tight, really. So let's stick another hoist in. What's the load on the hoist now? You might go, well, it's all completely even, completely symmetrical. It must be evenly between the hoists. So it must be. Okay, reasonable answer. But let's do our process that we just had with the equations of looking at each span and do this properly. So we're going to look at this span first. So it's symmetrical, it's half the screen, it's 500 kilos for that bit. It's the same again, it's uniformly distributed, the points are right at the end, there's nothing complicated going on, it's exactly what you would expect for that bit. You're going to have 250 going to that one and 250 going to that one. Fantastic, job done. Move on to your next span, which is this one. Same deal. Again, it weighs 500. Nothing complicated, moves the hoist in the same way. Now I have to do the adding up bit. So what you actually get using our proportional approximation thingy is 250, 500, 250. In terms of our little scenario of the 0.5 ton points in the roof, we've not actually made it any better, have we? We're still in kind of the same place. However, yeah, I have got room up there. We said this was just an approximation. It doesn't take into account the truss bending. It will depend on the truss, but the real numbers could well be something like, oops, all right, you'll all get seasick if I do that. That's a 6. So not only have you not solved the problem, you've actually made it a lot worse. The numbers that are quoted are 19, 62, 19 in terms of percentages. So I've got potentially 620 kilos on that center point. So your answer actually would be you'd have to go to 4. If I can just come back to PowerPoint, please. Oh. It will depend on the truss and it will depend on the spans, but here are the real numbers having done the maths for uniformly distributed loads. So that 3-point truss were 1962, 19. As you get more and more hoists, it gets closer and closer to that approximation. So the 4-point one's not quite so far out and the 5-point one's even less out. But the 3-point one is potentially a long way out. I'm not saying don't do 3-point trusses. I'm just saying be aware of the issues. Your numbers could be misleading. I went into a theatre that had just had a £1 squillion refit, a little bit like Liverpool out front. It was a false ceiling. They had permanently installed hoists in the roof for a front truss, 3 of them. The 2 outside points were 1 ton. The middle one was 2 ton. So they'd obviously thought about it a bit. So really, yeah, just be careful with 3-point trusses. What they've done here, it's the scenario I just was talking about, but they've snapped the roof rather than snapping the truss. So the weight on the center point on that video wall has been enough that it's snapped the goalpost. Cool. There you go. That is actually it. But just before we do Q&A and people start disappearing, I did say it last time, you will get a feedback email. please do reply to it. You know, obviously reply to it if you thought it was amazing, reply to it if you thought it was rubbish, but also reply if you thought it was okay. It's getting the whole spread of things, not just the extreme opinions. What did you like? What was bad? The level of it that it was aimed at, the pace. We're also kind of looking at possibly doing some future sessions. What would you like? I mean, it doesn't have to be these, but these are some possibilities. We could do one on an introduction to chain hoists. We could do one on working at height, personal fall protection, and PPE. That very definitely is, you need real world training on that, but we could look at some of the classroom stuff and some of the issues that are related to it. We could look at secondary suspensions, safeties. The one you all really ought to do, but I know perfectly well it probably sounds too boring, is you ought to do the basic law, regulations, codes of practice, standards. We could look at that. I could also do what I'm calling rigging QI. I've kind of got a whole load of little interesting bits, none of which are really long enough to make a presentation on their own, but we could chuck them in. There was some feedback from the Truss Part 1, people wanting training on hanging PA. I'm not sure that's something we can really do because it's product specific. And we also would need to be in a venue with the PA where we can hang points. But that said, a lot of the PA hanging issues would be part of that rigging QI one. If you wanted to do that, we would look at 3-point hangs and delta plates, if you know what that means. But they're just suggestions. If you can, if you've got any other ones, by all means. So do please do the feedback email. Okay, that really is it now. So if we've got any questions, by all means, via the chat, please. Obviously related to the content. I don't mind general rigging ones, but you need to be aware of the environment here and the other people. And sorry, but you're not getting a free consultancy service out of me. But, you know, by all means, ask. So if there are any questions, now's your chance.
We've got one so far from Craig on Facebook, and it's something that we touched on briefly last time, but you could maybe clear up something more in relation to what we've done today, and that is hanging video wall on 4-chord truss as opposed to 5-chord truss. What are the problems that you face? You know, what's different?
Okay, well, I'll do that as a quick resume because we did cover it last time, but it's such an issue, it's worth doing. Couple of things you see. Here's my bit of truss. I hang, because I need all the attachments in a straight line, you hang a whole video wall off one chord of the truss. No, you can, the reason though, you can think of it a whole load of different ways. First of all, manufacturer's data, all that's for the load being relatively evenly distributed between the two chords. Second now would be, you've only got half the truss. Once you put your pickup on it and things, and you're going to have to put quite some wraps in it to stop it rolling over, you're only using this structural truss. You're not using that one, so you only got half of it. The other thing that's going on is you're effectively shearing it. So you're trying to, we did a little thing last time with bamboo and string. You're trying to skew the shape of the truss. That's not how it's strong. It's strong in these directions, not in a rotating, twisting it apart. Your answers to it are, as you just pointed out, a lot of manufacturers are now making, particularly in the bigger truss, it has a center rail down the middle of it. They'll give you a load table for that center rail. It doesn't have very many braces, so they don't get in the way when you're hanging things, but the braces and the rail are really, really strong. So that would be an option. Oh, sorry, I need to tell you more problems before I give you solutions. The other thing you see people do is they hang the truss diamond format, because then it effectively gives you that center rail. That would be a no as well. Again, you're not using the truss how it's been designed, how the manufacturer has designed it, or your load stuff's out the window. If you think of the planes of strength, 1, 2, 3, 4, what you're doing is that way. That's not a plane of strength. There's no metal. Oh, there is. There's almost no metal at all in there. It's going to want to kind of stretch into a taller, thinner diamond, isn't it? It's not designed to be used that way. So don't diamond format truss. Apart from, I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's 3 letters, QX something. There's an American product that is, and it's something diamond truss. If you search diamond truss, it pops up. It's specifically designed to be hung diamond format for doing this. It's quite interesting, actually. I was looking at a picture of it, and it pretty much looked like bog standard truss, but they rotated the connectors so they were around the right way, and then they just put some big metal plates in at the end to stop that stretchy diamond thing going on. But there is truss that is specifically designed to do it. Your other option, and in some ways it's a bit time consuming, but in some ways the best, hang a scaff tube underneath. To a scaff to eye and hang your tube. Now you're going to have an awful lot of these because scaff tube's not very strong, but the advantage of that is it's not going to be a problem if you move one of them a couple of inches one way or the other, either to get it out of the cross braces, which is the problem if you go straight to the truss, or because where your clampy thing is where you want to hang the stuff. You can move them a couple of inches without it being a big deal, and then you're loading the truss perfectly. I've forgotten what the question was now, but I think that pretty much covers it, doesn't it? Yeah, when you need to hang a single line. I mean, a couple other things. You can't get ladder beam, which is basically just one plane. Problem with that is it's not actually particularly strong, so that doesn't work all that well. Another really good solution would be use triangular truss and hang it upside down. Well, apex down, it isn't upside down. Triangular truss can be used either way up, doesn't matter. You hang it apex down, you've got a single rail, you've got a proper top to put all your cables on, fantastic. Your problem with that is the real world. It's a bit of a simplification, but generally, truss manufacturers make small 30 centimeter, lightweight triangular truss that doesn't hold very much because the market for it is for hanging drapes and little bits of lights and not very much. So it doesn't tend to be very strong. But triangular truss would be another option. Yeah, that's got to be enough on that. Any more?
Matthew on Facebook is asking, is the distribution weight always 19 to 62 to 19 in terms of the ratio with 3 points, or can you adjust the ratio by moving the rigging points along the length of the truss? And he's asking, would you just stay clear of 3-point trusses as sort of 3-point hangs as a rule of thumb, or do they have the uses?
You can fiddle with it. You just need to look at what's going on. You know, if you bring the end points in to take some of the load off the middle, you're now starting to create cantilevers. So you need to be a little bit wary of that. As I said, I'm not saying don't do them, just be aware of the issue. You know, a lot of the time you've no option. You go into a venue, particularly theatres, once you're off the front of the stage, where the points are fixed. And your option with your front truss is to hang it on 2 or hang it on 3, and that is it. You just need to be aware of what the situations are. I'm seeking clarification on it, but I'm fairly sure the 1962-19 thing will change dependent on the truss. And if you think about it, if you've got super strong truss and you're not hanging very much off it, it's effectively becoming that rigid beam. So I would expect the numbers to be closer to our approximation. What I want to find out is if I've got super duper lightweight truss that's very, very bendy, could they be even worse than that? It's a ballpark to give you a heads up, just to be, you know, if you had 1-ton points, 1-ton hoists, it wouldn't be a problem. You know, you wouldn't need to worry about it. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I've managed a slightly more realistic length session this time. And please do the feedback email. And hopefully we'll see you again at some point.